ask Beth if she'll come along and share the reading with us. It's the same reading that we had last week, John's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 1 to 15.
John chapter 4, starting at verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. But he needed to go through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being weary from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered and said to her, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw."
Thank you. We'll be talking about Christmas, in fact, and for those that send Christmas cards, if you remember, we brought a string across the back here, or the front, sorry, behind me, and if anybody would prefer just to send a singular card addressed to all the church, to make it much easier rather than write out individual cards, then please do so. Feel free to do so and use that facility. Don't feel that you have to send a card to one and all and to everybody. If you put one on there, by all means, you've got personal ones that you want to send, by all means do that. It's not there to curtail you, it's there to help and to be used in regards of that. There we are. If I remember right, Kath, it was Bernard Johnson was the evangelist. I think David used to call him the Brazilian machine gun. That's it. He could preach and, he was a ball of fire. David's mum got saved on that. I think that was on the Saturday night. Yeah, I can remember. That she got saved down there, and lovely times. He taught us our chorus, or whoever was conducting the service, "Wherever I am, I'll praise him." That's where we learned that chorus, was down there through the week, I would imagine, but certainly on the Saturday night when there was a full house there. But marvellous ministry that he had. Preaching in South America, in Brazil in particular, and I remember him telling of one particular testimony. He preached one night, and he just felt he had these promptings, these leadings from God to what to preach on, and it would very often come just as the service was about to commence. I would be in panic system there if that was left to me, but he was quite comfortable with the whole situation, that the Lord was in charge, and he could change the sermon if he wanted to. And he preached on the first 5 people Jesus met in the Gospel of Mark. As a heading, you wouldn't put that on YouTube, would you? Take up the whole space on YouTube. The first 5 people, I think, Jesus met in the Gospel of Mark. And I think the 5th one is the man that was blind. And he's preaching on that part in the sermon, and all of a sudden, something cut loose. This wasn't in Newport. This was in a huge I don't know, not arena, but theatre, and the galleries were full, and all of a sudden something cut loose upstairs. They were cheering and screaming and all these different things, and so he put a stop to the service and asked whoever it was to come down. And the man had gone into the meeting blind, and as he's preaching, his eyesight has been given to him. I don't know if he was born blind or whether he'd gone blind. I don't know. Can't recall that. But I remember when he said about it, he said a sermon that came from God. That when he was on the fifth point, I think, or the fourth point, whatever it was, the first 4 or 5 people Jesus met in the Gospel of Mark, and eyesight was restored there and then. No hand laid on them at all, just God fulfilling his word. It's amazing what God can do, isn't it? Amazing what God can do. It's amazing what God did to this woman here. Those of you that watch Match of the Day, it's something that goes on at the moment, this thing about VAR. What does that stand for? Visual analysis. What is it? Video analysis. Video analysis review. So it just checks, allows the referee to check, is it a goal or is it a penalty or is there been foul play, that type of thing. And it's a great, they put it through in slow motion and they read it back to you about 4 or 5 times and all these different things. But this is what's going on in this. There's video analysis review going on in this because very often we come across people, especially in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, say, a lady by the name of, say Lydia, who came to Christ, and it just says simply, she's there where Paul is going to go to a prayer meeting and just to spend some time thinking about God, and he begins to speak to the group of people there, and it says, and Lydia took heed of the things spoken by Paul, and the Lord opened her heart. Like that, just like in a jiff, in a second, the Lord opened her heart. And but when we come to this woman in chapter 4, it's almost like in slow motion, step by step by step by step. And we see the different thoughts that she had in her mind, her bias initially, her reluctance initially, and then as the story unfolds, she gets more aware of this individual she's talking to as carrying something that she's not met with before. And in the end, she comes to a moment where Christ himself does something that I'm not aware that he does or says to anyone else in the New Testament. Absolute profound things that goes on there. And so it's almost in slow motion. Kath said when she became a Christian, she can tell you the night, but she can't tell you the actual, the things that were said, the things that were going on. Everything just seems in a flash. And here we have this account. The scene has been set last week when we looked at the first few verses of chapter 4, when it says Jesus had to go through Samaria. It wasn't because of some geographical need. There was an option to go different ways. When you journey from Jerusalem up to Galilee, there were a number of ways you could go. The preferred way for Jews, going from south to north or north to south, the preferred way, avoid Samaria at all costs, cross the River Jordan, go up on the right-hand side of the Jordan, cross back over when you've left Samaria, and then you come into Galilee. And so that would be the preferred way. Some were brave enough to, or were bold enough just to go down through Samaria, a straight run down from north to south, or go up south to north. It mattered little. If you went across the Jordan, it doubled your journey time and doubled the journey distance. It was a longer journey. We find with Jesus that he felt a great purpose in his journey towards Galilee from Jerusalem or Judea. There was a great sense of purpose in him wanting to cut through Samaria. And we find that there were times when God led him by the Spirit. We find that there were occasions with the Lord Jesus, it says, and he wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip. There are occasions when you can be so in union with heaven itself that even your daily chores or the daily things that you get up to are so in the hand of God that when he wants to go to Galilee, he goes up there and finds Philip. And Philip becomes one of his close disciples. A marvelous thing when you can be in so union with God. On other times, we are told that the Spirit drove him. The Spirit actually drove him into the wilderness, Mark says. He drove him. The other gospel writer says the Spirit led him. but there was a great impetus. And here we have this same impetus. Why was he going through Samaria? Why would he go to that? Is it about journey time? Does he really want to get to Galilee quickly, so quick, that he's willing to put up with the difficulties of Jews meeting Samaritans? And so we find with this, the scene is set. The disciples, we are told in verse 8, I think it is, the disciples, we are told, had gone into the city to buy food. He is sat on the well midday. Is it Noel Coward? Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. Well, Jesus is out in the midday sun, sitting just by a well, weary with the journey. And it shows, I suppose, humanity. But as the story unfolds, we find his divinity, his deity, his godlikeness coming through. The humanity is there, he's tired, he's hungry as well, for the disciples have gone to get food, and we know when this woman comes, he's thirsty. So the things that the human frame needs and desires, they are things that he experienced. And it says this, a woman, in verse 7, a woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. He opens the conversation. As the story unfolds, we begin to understand possible reasons why she's come out at such an unusual day. Normally, you draw water early in the morning, or at the end of the day, in the cool of the night. You don't set out to a well in the heat of the day. We see it on some of those WaterAid adverts, don't we, when they show some of those Ethiopian children and some of those children from Eritrea, and they set off early and they have to walk maybe 2 hours to get to some sort of sump of water. I don't say a well, but a sump of water that they drink from and feed or fill their bottles with. But she leaves the city of Sychar and comes outside of the city walls to this place, a well that was drilled by Jacob, and it's a well that's there today. It's 150 foot deep. It's quite precise, isn't it? She says in it, this well is deep. And if you notice, she said, this well is deep and you've got nothing to draw water with. The disciples had forgotten something, to leave the drawer of water with Jesus. Every traveller would carry it. Not a bucket, but some sort of wineskin with a rope that they would drop down into the well. They'd forgotten all about it, look. That's the precision of God's sin. You say, oh, I forgot it. But sometimes God's hand is in it. For you to see what God wants to do. And so we have this situation where this woman of Samaria, John kindly puts into it, the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. They did not like each other. And it goes back centuries. We dealt with that last week, but just suffice to say, they did not get on. We hear of it today, the North-South divide. And they have it in the UK, and they had it here in Israel as well. The Jews down in Judea didn't like the Galileans in the north. They talked differently, they mixed with different groups of people, but the worst bunch of all was that in the midsection, the Samaritans. No one bothered with them. No one liked them. They hated each other. Samaritans against Jews, Jews against Samaritans. And it's Jesus that opens the discussion. And she turns to him and immediately says, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink of me, who am a woman of Samaria? That's her first estimation of him. Without speaking to him, she could see what he was, the way he dressed. If you're a Jew, why are you asking me this? And so that's her first estimation of him. She sees him as nothing but a Jew. He did not disagree with it, because he was of Jewish blood. And so he didn't disagree with that at all. But what I find fascinating in this, in chapter 3, we did that comparison last week, didn't we? Of the comparison, chapter 3 and chapter 4. Nicodemus, the man he met in chapter 3, is so aware of his reputation, so much so that he came to Jesus by night. We read of Jesus that he has no care. or of his own reputation. In fact, we're told he made himself of no reputation. He emptied himself of his privileges. And by opening this discussion with the woman of Samaria, he was setting aside all convention, all propriety of the right way of doing things, and he could easily have had a earful, and you can hear the stark comment that the disciples make, not because she's a Samaritan, but because she's a woman, that he actually opened discussions with him. Because even then, it was quite normal for a husband never to talk to his wife in public. Astonishing, isn't it? The different culture differences, the different things that goes on. It would not be fitting sometimes for a high-ranking Jewish official to speak to his wife in public. Now Jesus set aside all convention. He set aside all those things that I listened to a tape by a brother called Willie Mullen. Now some of you might have heard of Willie Mullen. He was an Irish evangelist in Belfast. He was a man that when he was brought up, he had no shoes. He came from that poverty-stricken type of atmosphere. He got saved and he became a great preacher of the gospel. And Willie Mullen was coming back from an evangelistic service that he'd been holding. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. It's just gone 7:15. Coming back from an evangelistic service at 1 o'clock in the morning, as he's driving down the street to head home, he sees a woman on the street corner. He recognizes what she's there for. She's a street lady. And he did something which, if you did today, I don't know, you'd be thinking, am I opening myself up to something here to get in trouble? He stopped the car, went up to her, and she said, can I be of some service to you, sir? And he said, no, ma'am. I've not come to give you some money. I've come to tell you that God loves you. That Christ died for you. And that you can know a life that can set you free from this. And he left her. She got saved. Just from that little conversation. But can you imagine the headlines? Evangelistic preacher caught on the street corner with a street girl. He said, now we have to be careful in these situations, but he set aside the thought of the loss of reputation. And this is exactly what Jesus did as well. He set aside convention, set aside the right way of doing things that he might speak to this woman. Because this woman is the reason that he's come into Samaria. And all she can see of him at the moment is that she sees him as a Jew. Nothing else. He turns and continues the conversation with her in verse 10 and said, Jesus said to her, if you knew who it is, or if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is speaking to you, you would have asked of him living, what is it? And he would have given you living water. He talks to her and continues the conversation, and it goes on into verse 14. He talks about if you would have asked of him or asked of me, I would have given you living water. And in verse 14 he turns and says, whoever drinks of this water in the well shall thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. If you notice on his two brief statements, that's all they are, two brief statements. The first time he speaks to her is a question, give me a drink. Simple as that. The second are two statements that he makes about himself, of what he can do and what he wants to do. And she comes back with a response. And on both occasions, she gives this address, Sir. She's moved from him being a Jew to a man of worth, to a man that needs to be respected, because that's what that term means. Simple term, Sir. Very often when it's translated in the New Testament, it's translated as this, Master. Isn't it amazing? In a brief conversation with Christ, just two little statements are made, and then a question that is asked first that holds about 4 words in it, give me a drink. And yet she's moved from her racial bias that she would have, and the sense that it was so unusual for a man to talk to a woman in public. He had never met her before. This is a thing that you don't do. And he speaks to her and talks to her. If you only knew who you were speaking to, he would have given you living water. And so she moved from him just being a Jew to him being someone who needs to be respected. It's amazing how authoritative his voice could be. There are times when he stood by the grave of Lazarus, when he could speak to him that had been dead for 4 days and call out his name, Lazarus, come forth. And even the grave heard his voice, so that he came out of the grave. He carried such weight with his words. There were times that we looked, just I think last week, that there were times when he stood and cried with a loud voice. But there were times when he just taught people. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, that lovely 3-chapter sermon that he preached, it says this, right at the end of chapter 7, it says, the people were astonished at his teaching, for his words were with authority. They say about the 2 brothers. He was the director of Elim, George and Stephen Jeffries. They said, I remember hearing someone say, if Brother George Jeffries said that black was white, you'd believe him. He carried that type of authority. Now, it went overboard, that people esteemed him to a point that it became foolish in the end. But they tell me in his early days, when he would be preaching, that if he said black was white, then you'd believe it. Because he could speak with such authority. Now, Jesus was never dogmatic, he was never overbearing, but just 2 simple statements brings her from her racial bias into a position where she shows this manner of respect. This is a man of worth, a master, someone that demands that he be called sir. And so she turns and says to him, well, evermore give me this drink then. After he says, whoever drinks of this water shall never thirst again, and you almost want to sing that chorus then, no, never thirst again. No, never thirst again, isn't it? And he's brought her to a point, and you can hear it in her voice. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at this. It can be a cynical, sarcastic way of looking at it, or of her looking at it, or it could be that she's taken aback by this sense of authority that he carries, that she asks him this question. She turns around and says, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? Before he was just a Jew. Now she's asking the question, are you greater than our father Jacob, that gave us this well? You see, almost step by step, her heart is opening up, and questions are being asked and questions are being answered. Now, we could turn around and say, oh, she's being sarcastic. Are you greater than our father Jacob? But if you watch the way the conversation goes, it's a woman, an individual, a person whose heart is being drawn out more and more. Verse 16. Verse 16. Jesus said to her, he's brought her thus far in the conversation, and he says to her, now it's time to look at yourself. Go call your husband. That's all he says to her. And she turns around and says to him, I have no husband. And he turns and says to her, you've done well in saying that you have no husband, because you've had 5 husbands. And the man you're now living with is not your husband. In that, you've spoken true, he said. Where did he get that from? He'd never been there before. We could turn around justly say, I suppose, in chapter 1, where he meets Peter for the first time, that he'd spent most of the day with Andrew, his brother. And so when Peter came, he would say, you're Simon, the son of Jonah. You could turn around and say that. And say, well, possibly that Andrew had made him acquainted with his brother Simon. And then when we come to the situation again in chapter 1, where he turns and says to Nathanael, when Nathanael said, how do you know me? He said, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. And then when we come to situations, say in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 19, when he turns and says, as he comes into Jericho, to the old city, as he comes into Jericho and he says, sees a man up in a tree that he's never been there before, never seen before, and he says, Zacchaeus, come on down. How do you know that? You see, we're not dealing just with a human being here, we're dealing with divinity. And the lovely thing is this, that he knew all about her, and yet he still went looking for her. That's a lovely thought when you stop and think of it, isn't it? When you think about the mess your life can get in, sometimes you think, well, no one would want to bother. He went to Samaria for her, knowing full well what she was in. Knowing full well about you talk about a dysfunctional family, how there would have been no birth control in those days. So how many children would there have been? Whose father was whose? And of all the complexity. And it doesn't tell us how Jesus sorted out that complexity. It tells us how he went to meet her, and she, on meeting him, suddenly finds her heart opening up. Yes. And this woman with a confused, broken life that can't even go to the well in the morning or in the evening because others, like her neighbours, would poke fun at her or reject her. That's the assumption that we have to take. That's why she's going out in the midday sun. No one's going to bother with her. If they do say anything to her, it's some way of cutting her legs from underneath her. And she comes to a man that is willing to talk to her. And the more he talks to her, the better she feels. And the better she feels, the greater questions are being asked. Are you greater than our father Jacob? Well, we could put in, yes. But he didn't say that. He just needed to draw it out a bit more. Watch what she says now. Still the term of respect, sir. I perceive you're a prophet. See how it is, the VAR is opening up for us, how step by step by step. He was a Jew, then a man of worth, and now he's a prophet. In a single conversation that is open for us almost in slow motion, that we can see this woman that has such a difficult life here. And here she finds someone that wearily sat by the well, and yet the more he talks to her, the better he feels. Yeah. After the disciples come, now remember they've gone to get food for him. And so when they come back, they turn around and said, well, you better have something to eat. He said, I'm not hungry. What do you mean you're not hungry? My meat is to do the will of him that sent me. And just doing his will has filled me up inside. I just feel so full of substance here. He was sat wearily on the side of the well, but now he's firing on all pistons. And he's spoken to her. Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. There's a few more things that she wants to ask about. And he's able to correct her. She says, you Jews, you say that it's in Jerusalem that God is worshipped. But we say here is where God is worshipped. They actually built a replica temple, not quite as glorious, but on Mount Gerizim they built a temple there. The Samaritans. You say it's in Jerusalem, we say it's here. And so she had beliefs. But he's not afraid to challenge her beliefs. We can get a bit touchy sometimes when people challenge our beliefs. And we can feel a little bit edgy. We don't want confrontation about our beliefs. But Jesus confronted her and corrected the errors that she had. And when she came out of it, she was astonished at what this man knew. He knew her inside out and still wanted to talk to her. And he was able to speak to her the truths of the scripture to bring her into line with what God was wanting in her life. It's a marvelous thing when suddenly God can open the heart and speak to this woman here. She was astonished. When the Queen of Sheba, not Bathsheba, the Queen of Sheba, went to see Solomon, it says that she went because she had heard so many things. And when she heard the wisdom of Solomon and how he was able to answer all her questions, it says her breath was taken from her. She was astonished. She had not gone, as Hollywood says, to set up a love relationship between two kingdoms. She'd gone there to get converted. That was the reason she'd gone. She was taken aback at what she saw, what she heard, what this man was able to talk to her. Exactly the same is going on here. So he corrects her regarding her lifestyle. He corrects her regarding her beliefs. And in verse 25 it says to him, I know when the Messiah is coming, that he, when he has come, will tell us all things. It's a couple of things that's sad here. You can know that Christ is coming, but still live a life like this woman. I know the Messiah is coming, and yet still you can live an ungodly life. It needs to go further than here, doesn't it? It needs to come down into here. And so we come to this. She said, I know that the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he'll tell us all things. Now watch what Jesus said to her. She's right now. Jesus said to her, I that speak to you am he. I am not aware of him speaking in those tones to anybody else in the whole of the New Testament. I that speak to you am he. Well, time is gone. Oh, it's not so bad. What a marvelous thing can take place in a day. What a difference a day makes. That's the song that was written in 24 little hours. In a conversation, this woman has come from a bias to a position where she now is able to see that this is indeed the Christ of God. And when she goes back to tell her friends, or the men that were in the city that would know her so well, she turns and says to her, surely, this is the Christ of God. He's told me all things that I ever did. Marvelous what can happen within a heart, isn't it? How this lady can have her heart open. We see it with Lydia in a moment, whose heart the Lord opened. We see it with this woman, whose heart the Lord opened, but we see it now step by step. First a Jew, then a man of worth, of respect, and then a prophet, and then the Christ of God himself. His heart is open. Well, we call it a day then. Trust that the Lord will bring those things to light in our lives and in our hearts.